Welcome back to those of you who were with us last night. To those of us who are newcomers, my name is Frank Brennan. I'm a Jesuit priest and a member of the board of Jesuit Social Services, and I'll be the MC of proceedings during today. As is customary, we begin by an acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people, and we pay our respects to all elders who are with us this day. And we're going to build on the wonderful presentation that we had last night from Frank Vinson. Just to give a very brief overview of the process of the day, there are going to be 4 distinct areas covered with distinct sessions. This morning we start with crime prevention and diversion, then sentencing and restorative justice, prisons, and finally transitional and post-release support. And the format of each session is that we will have a keynote presentation for about 15 minutes, then we'll have panel involvement for about 15 minutes, and then there's 3/4 of an hour for all of us to participate. So you'll appreciate that we're trying to design a program where recordings are being made, notes are being taken for the future publication, but it's very much aimed at full participation. The one indulgence we'd ask of you is, given that our panellists are going to be restricted to about 3 minutes each, if you as members of the audience could restrict yourself hopefully to a minute or so with your intervention or question, that'd be great. But we would hope that this will then lead to a free-flowing discussion, so it might become more conversational. So you might have a number of minutes of involvement. So is that clear for you in terms of process? Great. Before I introduce Julie, just maybe to recap 2 or 3 images from last night with Frank Vinson, particularly for those of you who weren't here. Let's just recall Frank's wonderful image of his sitting there on the parole board and the young chap appearing before him trying to impress him to point out that he thought that Frank Vinson might have known his father. And Frank Vinson replying that, yes, well, in fact, I knew your grandfather. And just ponder for a moment what that means in terms of the criminal justice system. And then that other image he had of walking into the Alice Springs courtroom where he was going to defend a young Aboriginal man on a homicide charge, and walking past the Todd River and seeing similar events being replicated, and wondering about our own collective social responsibility and where did guilt really lie for what was said to be the criminal activity being perpetrated there. I was very struck by the comparison that Frank drew between community attitudes at the moment to asylum seekers and to those in prison and criminals. Those of you who haven't seen his printed paper, you might be surprised to know he does have a 10-page paper, single type spaced, and just about every word of it was delivered last night, but seemingly in a very spontaneous fashion. Quite an advocate. But in relation to asylum seekers, he drew this comparison. He said, what does our approach to asylum seekers suggest about us as a community and our actual as distinct from our asserted values is a question that to a large extent is very carefully avoided. Coded language and a rhetoric chosen to depersonalise the real people involved have been employed to provide a semblance of principle to cover the abrogation of our human responsibilities. Our approach to criminal justice has been similar in a number of respects, and to a substantial extent influenced by similar considerations. Again, we search for images and labels that separate and depersonalise those who are subject to it. We're reluctant to acknowledge that they're not only part of our society, but often the product of our own failures, injustices, and indeed our real rather than our asserted values. Crime, it must always be borne in mind, represents a distorted mirror image of our society, to some extent revealing features that we do not want to recognise, and some of which we do not want to accept responsibility. So we're very grateful to Frank for kick-starting us so splendidly last night. And in our first session this morning, we're going to come to crime, prevention and diversion. But as ever, it's with great pleasure that I introduce Julie Edwards, the CEO of Jesuit Social Services, just to say a few words.
Good morning, everyone. And as I say, most of you were here with us last night. And as Frank said, Frank Vinson set a very challenging and solid base for the rest of our symposium. In addition to those images that Frank Brennan has referred to, I was really struck with the sense of gap that he put to us between what we say or who we assert that we are as people and as communities, for example, that we're just and compassionate and humane, compared with our actions when it comes down to what we do, when it is either going to cost us or inconvenience us. So that's sort of still ringing in my ears. And today, as we move through the various components of the justice system, I think it's important that we keep that in mind. It's one thing for us to say what does it look like and how is it humane and effective, but what are we actually prepared to do when it either costs us or inconveniences us? Jesuit Social Services has been working in this space, with, particularly with young people in the justice system, for nearly 35 years. Yes, next year is our 35th anniversary. So it's from that base that we felt we needed to call this discussion together, this public discussion, because we're very concerned about the way that the people that we work with are being, and many of us here work with, are being portrayed for what we would say very superficial or opportunistic purposes. And we think that it's important that we step aside from the various issues at the one level that we keep, as they pop up, we keep addressing, whether it be mandatory sentencing or whether it be abolition of suspended sentences, all very important issues, but that we stand back to some extent and look at what does a humane and effective justice system look like. What kind of community do we want to have? And we want to raise the level of that discussion to some principles, values and evidence-based research and interventions that we can explore together, rather than knee-jerk, looking tough on crime responses. So we want to bring that kind of moral, principled and intelligent and informed thinking and discussion forward. And we're very grateful that you are part of that you value that kind of discussion too, and that's what we're here for. So thank you very much for being with us today, and look forward to the discussion over the course of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. So we'll come to our first session today, the first theme to consider, crime prevention and diversion. And we've got about an hour and a quarter together till 10:30. Our initial presenter will be Professor Tony Vinson, and then we have our panel with us, and then time for questions and discussion. We're delighted to have Tony with us from north of the Murray, one of the truly great advocates for criminal justice reform in Australia. Tony has worked for many years with Jesuit Social Services, particularly producing the groundbreaking national study, Dropping Off the Edge, which was published in 2007 and which has helped to inform so much of the social policy approach of the present federal government. Tony is Emeritus Professor at the University of New South Wales and an Honorary Professor in the Faculty of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. His career spans the disciplines of social work, social policy, psychology, education, public administration and social research. He was appointed the Foundation Director of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics Research in 1970. Could I just repeat that? In 1970. Over 40 years ago, there he was as the Foundation Director of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. Following the Royal Commission into the New South Wales prison system, Tony then headed the Department of Corrective Services, And so he's not only been an academic with a profound impact in this discipline, but he was there controlling the levers in making changes after a profound Royal Commission. In recent times, he chaired an independent inquiry into New South Wales public education. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we couldn't have a better person from around Australia than Tony Vinson to open for us the issue crime prevention and diversion. Tony.
I just was thinking about that program, This Is Your Life, that we used to watch on the television as Frank was speaking, and wondering if my wife or someone was going to come through the door. Well, look, in our understandable desire to prevent crime, we need always to keep in mind the definitional flexibility of what it is we're intending to prevent. When many decades ago I turned up each day for my first job, working in a large prison, no pedophiles were incarcerated, no child abusers, no one was on terrorism-related charges. A whole prison was set aside to hold people convicted of what were termed homosexual offences. There was the occasional detained debtor, and some unfortunates were being held beyond their initial sentence, would you believe, until their mental defectivity improved. I don't recall any drink driving or drug-related offenders, but vagrant drunks there were aplenty. They accounted for a third of all those admitted. So before we get a little technical about crime prevention, here's a reminder that one career, obviously from what Frank has said, a very long one, can span quite changing emphases in what society identifies as crime, reminding us that, at least in some respects, crime is not the object but the product of criminal policy. There was a more durable core of serious offenders there, robbery, serious fraud and the like. Nevertheless, given the variability of human actions attracting the attention at different times of the criminal justice system, no consideration of crime prevention is realistic without acknowledging that the definitions we employ, the policies that we create, and the energy with which they're prosecuted may lead to a rise or fall in the rate of crime. Perhaps following that introduction, I should say, and don't underestimate the impact of having lots of conversations with the judiciary and inviting them out to the jail to have a look at the place to which they're committing people. As a matter of fact, in the almost 3 years that I was head of corrective services, I think I talked down the economy, because the punishment economy, because the number of people in jail went from 4,000 down to 3,000. I put it down to all those dinner parties with judges, actually. Anyway, crime prevention is a very broad subject, and I'm going to concentrate in the remainder of my comments on an aspect of it that I've been involved in with Jesuit Social Services. Other people on the panel will raise other facets. Well, given our interest in preventing crime, why wouldn't we be interested in knowing where the perpetrators come from? Especially here in Victoria, where 1.5% of the state's postcodes account for 25% of the admissions to prison, and when pretty much the same list of postcodes accounts for the same proportion of juveniles held on remand. Such facts invite questions about the characteristics of the communities that are productive of high levels of crime. That curiosity triggered formal studies at least 150 years ago in England, where social variables, including illiteracy, were found to be spatially linked to crime. Much of the work that followed focused on the geographic concentration of conditions or circumstances affecting individuals or families. The locational studies undertaken over more than 10 years now by Jesuit Social Services have in part been of that character. And here you see the list of kinds of variables that have been used to plot the distribution of disadvantage in this state. I'll just leave you to read them. Multiple forms of disadvantage have simultaneously been taken into account in mapping marked concentrations of disadvantage throughout Victoria. That approach has been quite revelatory. First, there's a marked overlap of unwanted high levels of the conditions represented by the indicators in a limited number, and I would say a socially manageable number, of locations. This is true of Victoria, just as it's true of the Australian states generally. At the heart of the patterns of interconnected problems is a combination of deficits in three spheres: educational achievement, both school and post-schooling, income, and occupational standing, embracing lack of work skills and long-term unemployment. Where these conditions are concentrated, there too you find a concentration of criminal behaviour. In Victoria's 20 most generally disadvantaged areas, all but 2 ranked in the top 12% on criminal convictions. Taking a broad view of the results, there are some communities in which people, young and old, are caught in a web of disadvantage, and the implications for crime prevention, indeed for upholding social justice, are clear. The strands of the web have to be loosened in a coordinated way, with an emphasis on early intervention and prevention. The oft-proclaimed principle of integrated service provision, governmental and non-governmental, must become a reality, not just something spoken of at conferences. Fortunately, some tangible efforts of this kind do exist, but time constraints don't allow me to go into details. They range across primary to later stage initiatives, like establishing, where necessary, postnatal support and parenting skills, reducing impediments to learning at the outset and throughout schooling, the acquisition of labour market credentials, target hardening, as it's called, in public places using appropriate design measures, correctional opportunities at the arraignment stage of legal processing, in which Victoria, in my opinion, currently sets a comparatively high standard. Purposeful diversion, prison training when it gets to that stage, and education, quality supervision in community-based corrections, and transitional assistance following a sentence, to name just some of the possible provisions. But there's another exciting thread to the Jesuit Social Services project, which to a degree anticipated what has emerged as probably the most discussed international theme in contemporary community crime prevention. The perspective in question focuses on the influence of community-level characteristics, not reducible to the individual or family. This is a distinction which many people, including those with social policy responsibilities, find it difficult to make in a society habituated to ascribing well-being and its reverse to individual and family circumstances and effort. However, the richness and accessibility of certain community-level data collected by government in Victoria has opened another window. It's been possible for us to examine the influence of what might be termed neighbourhood social climate in amplifying or compressing the effects of limited education, unemployment and other factors frequently associated with crime. And Jesuit Social Services findings in this respect are consistent with that contemporary body of research indicating that community-level measures can identify environments which independently contribute to the prevention of crime and which, by their absence, facilitate its occurrence. The Jesuit Social Services contribution builds on the work of scholars who have long been drawn to the quality of the bonds that link people to each other and the locality in which they live. To mention just one of those scholars, Jane Jacobs, in the 1960s criticised social planners for their insensitivity to the unseen fibre that holds successful communities together, what she called the fine structure of society, consisting of networks of trust and norms of reciprocity. A succession of theorists has added to our understanding of related strands of this unseen fibre that helps to integrate successful communities. They've emphasised the importance of social bonds with high levels of trust and norms of reciprocity, associations that bridge social divisions and practices and institutions that contain conflict to manageable levels. These are characteristics that apply at the community level, as distinct from individuals and subgroupings of various kinds. A current variant of this theme is called collective efficacy. The term is associated with the work of Robert Sampson and Associates, whose research has found that high levels of local participation in organisations, the exercise of informal social control, the ability and willingness of residents to guide the behaviour of others towards pro-social norms, mutual support for children, and the density of local friendship networks reduce levels of crime. In a word, Sampson and colleagues have found that a combination of social cohesion, trust, and a willingness to intervene for what is thought to be the common good is associated with reduced violence and delinquency. And I must say other things, psychiatric illness, well-being generally. Locality problem profiles of the kind that I earlier mentioned, those generated by the work we did in Dropping Off the Edge, continue to be important. But the current literature reminds us of the importance of more dynamic processes in shaping well-being and staying on the right side of the law. Crime rates are related to neighbourhood ties and patterns of interaction, social cohesion, informal social control, and the shared expectation that neighbours will intervene on behalf of their neighbourhood. And these things can be cultivated. Of course, there are no silver bullets available to remedy community problems. The professional deployment of community-level strategies must be subject to the same discernment and care required of all practice theories. Here in Victoria, the Jesuit Social Service Studies reveal striking encouragement for the importance of community-level processes in combating crime, as well as other forms of disadvantage. We've cross-tabulated our indicator data with the findings of continuous health surveys undertaken by the Victorian authorities. Survey data gathered from approximately 38,000 respondents over the period 2001-2005 was aggregated, and a sample of about 500 postcode areas were divided into categories reflecting the location's degrees of social cohesion. This division was based on responses to 8 survey items that approximated very closely to the concept of social efficacy. The strategy for exploring whether an area's location in the cohesion categories affects the impact of disadvantageous social conditions turns on the fact that we know from decades of research that there are established connections between many such conditions and associated variables. The relationships include circumstances like unemployment, limited work skills, early departure from school, low income, and these things are known to be associated with criminal convictions, imprisonment, psychiatric hospital admissions, and child maltreatment. We had 24 pairs of such established connections within that range of indicators that I've already shown you. But here we concentrate on just 7 bearing on crime. The first column shows the size of the correlation, so that ranges, as you know, from -1 to +1. It's a statistic. The more two things co-vary in tandem, the higher the correlation will be. So with that first column that's before you now, shows how things stood across the whole 500 postcodes. So a general sample of the community. The crucial question is whether the recalculation of the same correlation between, say, unemployment and imprisonment, or low family income and imprisonment, produces a consistent change in the strength of the connection as we move from low to high social cohesion. The question to be asked in each instance is, does social cohesion in the character of collective efficacy operate to contain or dampen down the ill effects of disadvantageous social conditions? The 2007 dropping off the edge findings parallel those we reported in 2004, but were frankly too shy to report very widely because they seem so decisive. One is always suspicious about anything that comes out as clearly as it did at that time. Again, in 2007, we found contrasting correlation coefficients within the low and the high cohesion categories, with a reduction in every instance in the degree of association, you might say the inevitable connection between the 24 pairs of variables. Social cohesion does indeed appear to exert a strong buffering effect. Overall, the size of the correlation within the high cohesion category was at least halved from that in the low category in 6 of the 7 crime-related pairs before you. Such findings are consistent with the international social efficacy literature. While by no means the final word on the matter, or dismissive of the importance of the other measures that I mentioned earlier, and which colleagues will no doubt comment on, the findings point to the wisdom, I would say necessity, for systematic trialling and evaluating the impact of remedial measures and strengthening community-level processes on reducing crime. Of course, a sensible trial of the social efficacy approach requires time, not the traditional one term of government. If, as the evidence suggests, localised criminal patterns can become entrenched over decades, then we need to realise that countermeasures need to be sustained for a minimum of something like 7 or 8 years. Apart from serving the public's own self-interest, social justice requires nothing less than the adequate resourcing of this approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And we now have a panel of 4 persons, Kate Orty, Bernie Geary, Patricia Faulkner and Terry Laidler. What we've asked them to do is to briefly introduce themselves in the context of addressing the topic to hand and to take a few minutes each before we move into our general discussion. Kate.
I think this is working. Is it working? I've turned it on. It should be working. Thank you. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement, and it's different than the one I usually start with about Wurundjeri people, because it tells you about me and it tells you about us and it tells you about what I think is important. But I do acknowledge Wurundjeri people, and I'd like us to acknowledge every young Aboriginal child and youth who spent the night in a prison or police cell last night. That's my acknowledgement to start today. The second thing I've done, and I wasn't asked to do it and I've made some difficulties for people, is I've got 3 slides that tell you where I think I've come from, and they're slides that I walked out of the car and took at the Old Hay prison, just completely serendipitously in very recent days. The first of them, if we could, is the doorstep. It's extremely worn. That's the one that everybody steps over. You could do this exercise any prison you go to, any place you want to look at what we do in relation to prisons. It drives me. The second slide is what a prison looks like when all the doors are open and at the end of it we see the light at the end of the tunnel. But you have to wait until we turn prisons into tourism institutes before you get that vision. The third slide is what tells you what we then do with prisons. If we build it, they will come. The Hay prison, when we stopped using it for incarcerating people who we thought should be there, we started using it for wayward girls from New South Wales. They courageously went back, as you can see, in 2007 for a reunion, and I'm sure it broke hearts but made bonds. I'm previously a magistrate here in Victoria and also in WA. I've been involved in Aboriginal sentencing courts, and it's one of the things that significantly drives me. And Daniel Briggs, I'm very pleased to see here today, who was the first Aboriginal Justice Officer, and you'll hear from him. What I want to say is very briefly about a few diversionary programs that I've been involved in, but I want to give you 2 case studies, and I'm simply going to read them because otherwise I'll forget to make some points. The first is: in Shepparton, I sat with Yorta Yorta elders when a young man presented as having speared another Aboriginal person in Gippsland. He was acting in anger and he was responding to denial of housing to his estranged wife who had their 3 children in her custody. He came from a large family, all of whom had been at the Ballarat orphanage, and there were now decade-long rifts amongst the surviving children. His very distant and distressed sister came to court. He came into court in ochre and shirtless to make a cultural point. He had a suspended sentence hanging over his head for an earlier offence of violence against that very estranged wife. The court was full of family and extended family members, and that was because the Aboriginal Justice Officer Daniel Briggs and the panellists, the Aboriginal elders, had organised those attendances. One of this man's sisters attended, and she attended because one of the elders invited her to come and then persistently followed up to make it happen. The sister spoke for 20 minutes in the plea. It was her evidence about what happened to the family and her traumatised expressions of the need for and commitment to family reconciliation which swayed the court around the overall sentence. The young man spoke himself, impassioned about loss and culture and its reassertion, and deeply distressed about the prospects of keeping his family together. As the magistrate, I placed him on a community-based order with heaps of hours of community work, as his auntie had come from Warrnambool to Shepparton to say there was cultural development work for him to do. He did the work, his kids are with him, and 8 years later he hasn't been back in trouble, and that's something given the record that he brought with him into the court that day. The second case is one out of Kalgoorlie, where we set up an Aboriginal sentencing court without the assistance of legislation, effectively saying we'd do it and relying on the community to assist us to get there. A child of 12 was charged with aggravated burglary and going armed with a knife at night in Kalgoorlie. Brings him into a category of aggravated burglary because it's at night and he's armed, and he was in company. His mother had substance abuse problems. She lived with a violent de facto who was not the child's father, and she had a new baby and was pregnant again. The youth worker had compiled a very lengthy report on the child, and the youth worker had been in town for a very little while, and the youth worker was very pleased with that report. The panel of Aboriginal people who I met with that day in the Kalgoorlie tea room, because of course there are never facilities enough for these particular innovations, where we talked about the cases for the day, they had access to the child's report, and that was of course with the approval of the Aboriginal Legal Service and the President of the Children's Court in Western Australia. It was not objecting to us conducting ourselves in that way. One of the senior women sitting with me that day started to ask questions about the child to determine if she had his history correct because she had access to the report. It quickly transpired that this extremely dense report, and I'm talking about a centimetre dense report, lacked the following information. The child had been raped in the public toilets at Boulder late at night by a white person when he was 7. He'd made a police statement. He'd given evidence at an unsuccessful trial, and you only have to sit in one trial in Western Australia in relation to Aboriginal matters to see how intimidating that could be. The trial was, of course, of the alleged offender. The alleged offender was acquitted. The child was then returned to live with his struggling mother with no additional supports. None of that was in the report. It could only have been there because we had the conversation in the tea room, almost serendipitously, but relying upon Aboriginal people's voluntary participation in the court process. The ALS court officer, who was a very committed local Aboriginal man who should long ago have been supported to get a law degree, was asked to come into the court without his client so the matter could be clarified without further traumatising the child. The ALS officer hadn't the time to read the report and needed to have his memory of the child's history prompted, notwithstanding that he was such a thoroughgoing, terrific bloke who knew what he was doing. The input of the Aboriginal panellists meant that the police were better able to understand why the child might be carrying a knife. It impacted on their submissions, and the court was better able to insist that some trauma counselling be sourced for the kid himself. In the end, I actually doubt whether that occurred, and it was clear that there'd been no trauma counselling after the trial, the rape and the acquittal. The child attended that particular sentencing court, and we had great appearance rates, unusually in Western Australia at these sentencing courts, by himself, on time and dressed as best he could be in clean clothes, which would have been a considerable struggle for him. His mother showed up later under the influence of substances. The only people who knew that child's story were the panellists. The child came back into court sometime later for shoplifting clothing, and I didn't see him again for another burglary matter. The question really for me, out of all of that, and comparing these examples of what I've been exposed to because of Indigenous people's warmth, generosity and commitment to their community and their unstinting participation, is what chance did either this man or this young person, this child, this 12-year-old, have without a culturally grounded court trying to divert them out of the jail system? That's all I want to say.
Thanks, Kate. Now, Bernie Geary.
I'd just like to add to what Kate said in terms of acknowledgements, I'd like to acknowledge all of those children in Victoria who find themselves in the child protection system or in the out-of-home care system. I guess listening to Tony, who I only discovered, 10 years ago, wasn't related to Frank. I did see it written down. I thought, hello. I worked in the initial part of my career about 38 years ago in the Olympic Village area of West Heidelberg. And I then moved and worked running the Brosnan Centre for many years also. And I won't go on about that, apart from the fact that, in retrospect, I think about West Heidelberg and realise that there was no such thing as youth homelessness in West Heidelberg. You couldn't live here, you went and lived here. And there was a deep and abiding sense of community there. Lots of problems, as Tony mentioned, in those communities, but a great sense of community. And then going to the Brosnan Centre, where in fact we took young people away from out of the prisons and supported them as they were released, there was in fact no community. We developed a plastic community. Lenny Atone was here helping us do it. So much so, in fact, that the great Ted Whitten, who was the late great Ted Whitten, who was then the sales manager for Adidas, used to bring me huge truckloads of Adidas tracksuits, seconds, every year, and we used to dress the kids in the tracksuits. And one day the Brunswick police came down and said, Bernie, every kid in Brunswick who's doing a boo is wearing an Adidas tracksuit. But we did develop communities that were the best we can do, but they were false communities. They were we were pushing kids together, we were pushing young people together who had similar issues, and I don't think that was very healthy in retrospect. And now I find myself as a Child Safety Commissioner, and one of the principal areas that I'm involved in is the out-of-home care area, where we have about 5,500 kids in Victoria who are in the out-of-home care system, but about 500 of those are at the very pointy end of the system who live in residential care. And those kids, once again, are forced together. I had one young woman ringing me over the last 2 weeks who lives in a house with 4 boys. She says she's on the run, she's running away, and she rings me about every second day and tells me that she left the home because the boys want her to prostitute herself, to bring money in for drugs, etc. But she's a kid who's been forced into a situation. Not only has she no family, but she has no community, and she's frightened of the situation that the state has put her in to care for her, which I think is an even stronger indictment on how we are unable to move kids into normal communities. We've created false communities for kids with our institutions and with our processes, and I think the juvenile justice figures at the moment are that about 25% of the young people who are moving into the juvenile justice system are kids who are directly from our state services. So we are really staining our kids, and that's the best way, and I know it's a fairly bizarre way of describing it, but I think it's one thing to look at prisons as they are, but let's look at why we are pushing kids into the prison system. We're creating a system where kids have got no choice.
Thanks, Bernie. Now, Patricia Pop.
Thanks, Frank. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Chairman of Jesuit Social Services and the Chair of the Prime Minister's Social Inclusion Board and a former Secretary of the Department of Human Services in Victoria, starting off my career actually in, I think it was called the Social Welfare Department in Shepparton. My perspective today, I suppose I've reflected overnight on what Frank Vinson said yesterday, and what I took from what he said was that for everyone who ends up getting a sentence, being convicted of a crime and getting a sentence, they end up with a punishment for their own actions, but they also take punishment on behalf of the community, because the community has set up a structure in our society that means that some people from some postcodes, from some ethnic backgrounds, from some areas of poor health, take much more punishment than other people in the community. And so I agree totally with Tony's talk this morning that says that the place to start is within community. But I want to go beyond the within community. I think that stands for itself, and we have to work out how we, as members of the community, don't push away the problems that exist within community and expect public servants to solve them. And I'm probably one of the greatest defenders of public servants, even public servants in the child protection system, because I see the game that's played at the moment by the press and by many people is try and, I think it was Matthew Ricketson that said recently, pin the blame on the public servant. And we're very conveniently saying, as a society, we really don't want to have to deal with these issues. We want somebody else, perhaps a 28-year-old social worker, to deal with these problems. And so I think Tony's absolutely right. We start with community, and we start with citizens in that community taking responsibility for the society that we've created. But I want to move on to something that Frank Brennan mentioned last night from the Social Inclusion Board's work and from further work that Tony Vinson did last year in talking to people who had actually tried to break cycles of disadvantage and to talk about what worked for them in trying to break out of cycles of disadvantage. Because part of the problem with public policy at the moment is that we draw on what people think and their prejudices to make public policy rather than drawing on what we know works. And so the three things that were found that helped people break cycles of disadvantage were, number one, the way you treat people. Not what you give them, not what you pay them, not what service system they're in, but how do you treat them. And most of the people who mentioned that they had got themselves out of a cycle of disadvantage said there was some significant person in their life that believed in them, that gave them hope and gave them aspiration and treated them with respect and dignity. And I suppose if you look at a prison system, you wonder where any of that is present in a prison system. The second thing that people talked about was that they needed ongoing support. They really needed a university degree in government and community services service provision because they had so much of it. Different times, different episodes, different social workers, different caseworkers. And so the second thing, if we're thinking about creating a humane and efficient system, is how do we bring the continuity of service? We know at a very early stage of people's lives that they are going to be people that are on the pathway to prison. We know that. If you work in the child protection area, you know at 3 or 4 that a lot of the children, you sometimes know before they're born that they're going to follow a particular pathway. So we have to think about, when we're thinking about a new system, first of all, respect, dignity, aspiration and hope. Secondly, continuity and staying with people for the distance. And then the third thing that we found in our research was that no matter how well you do those things, you have to keep looking at the systems and looking at structural barriers. Because if you read most of the literature, you'll find that poverty is one of the key social determinants of both poor health outcomes, poor justice outcomes, poor educational outcomes. So we have to keep working at the basic systems of housing, income support, child protection and so on. So I just wanted to leave you with those thoughts, that if we started again and we wanted a system that had the minimum number of people going to prison eventually and did no harm to people, we would start from a position of not looking to punish people, but looking to work out how we accord people greater respect, greater dignity and greater hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. And finally, Terry Laidler.
Terry Laidler, I chair the Victorian Mental Health Reform Council. Its job is partially, I'm getting up because I've got to read my own figures. Its job is partially to oversee the implementation of the state's mental health reform strategy. I've got a proposal that I want to put you today, if we can see the next slide. There's some numbers that I dug out the other day. I'm not going to read them in any great detail. One of the aims of the mental health reform strategy is to get early intervention into areas where we know that people develop serious mental health problems. Okay? One of the ways you do early intervention is you identify people at particular risk of having a high incidence of mental health problems, and you develop specific ways of dealing with their needs. For example, women postnatum at risk of developing various forms of depression. So you put in place a system that quickly identifies people who have that problem. We have a very good one in Victoria. The maternal and child health system does that moderately well, okay? I want to take up Patricia's point and say that there are certain groups of kids in our community that we know are at extreme risk of developing severe mental health problems, but also of being incarcerated, of having broader health problems and all that. It's not an unlimited number of kids. Not an unlimited number of kids. I was talking to the Secretary of Justice at one stage and she said she probably could name about 2 or 3 dozen of them herself. You know, these are people that, I say in a pejorative sort of way, but I don't mean it like that, get on the conveyor belt at the time of the child protection system. They fall on and off it at different stages, but if they stay on the conveyor belt long enough, they'll end up at Fulham Prison by the time they're 23, 24 or something like that. We've all met these people, okay? We have various systems in our community that are meant to deal with them, and they're not working real well. So we've got an identifiable group of people at specific risk, with systems in place at the moment that don't seem to mitigate that risk particularly well. I want to say let's mitigate it. What we did in the mid-90s in Victoria was we said the adult prison population was changing radically, and that among those going to prison now were a significant number of people with intellectual disability and serious mental health needs. And we said it's going to cost us money, but if we set up a specialist service system for those people, we do 2 things. We give them the best chance of recovery and we mitigate the risk to the community. And so we set up a thing called the Victorian Institute of Forensic Mental Health that runs a secure hospital out of Fairfield, provides services in prisons, maintains just under 1,000 people in the community under court order, and operates within area mental health services to take referrals and steer people in and out of the system, do some sort of liaison work. I want to say we need, that's called forensic care in common parlance, that system. I want to say we need forensic care junior or its equivalent. That if you take my numbers, and I'll take the national numbers, and you look at number 1, I can't even read it because I haven't got my glasses on, I should have done a printout of it, shouldn't I? If you look at the kids about whom allegations of child abuse or neglect are substantiated, okay? Not the reports, but where it's substantiated, you've already got prima facie evidence that these kids have been traumatised. Okay? And the effects of trauma are known in adults, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. In kids, it leads to a wide range of mood disorders and anxiety conditions. Okay? These are kids at particular risk. If you come down the next step and look at the kids who, because they're involved with child protection, we end up making certain types of orders about, it's a more limited number of kids. Okay? But very particularly, I'd say you could identify the kids in out-of-home care and particularly the kids in our residential facilities, okay, at extreme risk. And I think each of our panellists has mentioned that in one way or another. Then come down the next step, the green bit, and look at the kids who are one way or another subject to orders of the court in the juvenile justice system. So rough numbers, but not unlimited numbers, significant numbers that would take a fair effort. I want to say we need to set up a specialist agency like Forensic Care Junior to undertake the assessment, the treatment and the supervision of kids in that system with a particular view to reducing the negative outcomes for those kids. That's all I want to say. And we could do that tomorrow if we wanted to. It might cost us a bit of money, but instead of having the fragmented bitsy approach that we have to these people who are at real risk and in real need at the moment,
What we do is assign responsibilities to some service system for actually making sure they get better outcomes, not for just doing more of what we've always done, which we know produces very, very inadequate outcomes.
Thanks, Terry, and I'd like to thank the very competent panel for keeping to the time limits. So we've now got plenty of time for questions and discussion. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Scott Prasser, who's joined us this morning. Professor is the Director of the Public Policy Institute of ACU, which is co-sponsoring this event with Jesuit Social Services, and he happens to be my boss. So, now, we're going to move quickly into questions and discussion. I might just see first whether Tony would like to make any response to anything he's heard from the panel.
No, I think...
Right? Okay. Let's move right along. Correct. Oh.
I just want to say that we could even add other perspectives to those that have been uttered, and it's not a case of any single thing being the answer, in my opinion.
Right.
Okay.
Now I'd invite you briefly identify yourself and then speak briefly or ask a question.
Greg James, New South Wales Mental Health Review Tribunal President. My question is to Tony Laila. Looking at the green portion of his slide and the some 6,000 juveniles in detention, what proportion of that population is suffering from intellectual disability, mental illness or mental condition, or other debilitating disadvantage?
I don't have good figures on that. It was very hard just to dig out these figures for what it's worth, to get good, accurate data on who the kids are. You'll notice that the Northern Territory and Western Australia didn't supply data into one of the data sets up there. So it's very hard to get the data, because I think if we assemble it, we might be scared about what we find. My anecdotal experience would suggest all of them, okay? Because any kid that we put into the juvenile justice system is traumatised by that experience. Now, the reaction of people to trauma is not unitary. Not everyone who undergoes a traumatic experience, goes on to develop anxiety conditions or mood disorders or something like that. But huge numbers of them do. We know that. That's why we set up counselling services after disasters and things like that. So I reckon if you started from the presumption that all of these kids would have either disabilities that need to be managed and their outcomes optimised, or mental health disorders that need to be treated so that they might recover. If you started from that presumption, it would be a better presumption. The one we start from now is that these people somehow or another are morally reprehensible, okay? They need to be punished for it, and on the way we'll give some of them some treatment. We start from the wrong premise.
Okay.
I just want to also it's another story. A 12-year-old child on a Saturday morning in the Kalgoorlie court picked up on the Friday night, and he's charged with stating false name and address. And he came into the court, and I was the magistrate on that day, and I said to him, "What on earth are you doing here? Why did you state a false name and address?" The child said to me, "It's because I thought I had a warrant." He'd never been in trouble in his life. He thought he had a warrant, and he gave a false name because that was routinely how people responded to police apprehensions on a Friday night in his world. What a scandal.
Yes.
David Leary, originally from Sydney, recently in Melbourne. Just a comment and a question regarding Terry's points. Decades ago in New South Wales, we were talking about the problem of net widening, that is, drawing young people in to an ever-growing juvenile justice system, because we weren't discerning between what was stuff that needed to be treated in that system and what could be dealt with in the community. My fear about your suggestion is that we do exactly the same with a mental health ideology or an approach, that we net widen and drag people into a mental health approach where I think, while I acknowledge that that is an important element of what we should be doing, I think there are lower order types of intervention that could be focused more on the community or the social elements rather than pathologising.
I'd share that fear, and the proposal also gets criticised for pathologising kids. I would say if you set up a specialist agency with awareness of those issues, this current group of kids, I'm not dragging anyone in, this current group of kids will get better services than they get now. And secondly, if that agency is actually evidence-based and well-led and all the other things, I mean, this is very shorthand here, I would say that it would have a real policy against net widening, if you know what I mean. I mean, the adult service doesn't widen its net. It's hard to get into. People complain about that. So I share your concern, and I share the concern about pathologising kids, but I say that using those two things as rationales not to improve what's, with respect, a crap service system is just not on anymore.
However, here in Victoria, we have a child who offends receives much more substantial services than a child who is in the out-of-home care system or simply in the child protection system. A child who offends gets better services. How to start?
I was sat in the Ballarat Magistrates Court when a magistrate convicted a 9-year-old boy of an offence. Now, I mean, legally that's just nonsense, but that's what the magistrate did. And when challenged by the lawyer about that, she said, but if I give this kid to juvenile justice, I know they'll get the services they need. If I don't convict the child, they'll just keep getting what they're getting from child protection.
Because here in Victoria we have a unique dual track system which we're very proud of, that does offer much more substantive services to young offenders.
Yes. Yeah, and then the lady over here.
Peter Matheson. I'm a retired student welfare coordinator, amongst other things. I have a word that I think sums up a huge amount of the problems we all face, and that is exclusion. Exclusion from some of our mainstream systems, right? Not just putting into outside or other systems, but not using our real mainstream systems properly. And so much starts from the process of exclusion from anything. Any human being who is excluded from anything will react.
Schools are pretty good starts.
No. Yeah? Yes.
I'm Jo Buckley. I work in youth justice based in Shepparton. Most of my work is in Cobram. I'd like to make a couple of comments. Of my own clients, every one of them has a mental health issue or an intellectual disability. Every one of them. Most of those mental health issues have arisen as a result of childhood trauma and or subsequent drug abuse, and the drug abuse is simply an escape from an intolerable life. Not one of my children, my work kids, has a parent who is employed. Not one. I have one who is attending school in Cobram, a young man of incredible resilience. He's 18, he's finishing year 11 and 12. He has a 12-month-old son and a 4-week-old son. He's one of our big success stories. But getting our kids into schools or into any form of education which will assist them to in some way overcome what they've experienced is almost impossible. I have one other young man who I was able to, who'd been expelled from schools in Cobram and Shepparton, who's successfully completing year 11 at the Catholic school in Laila. He's another success. But these are two very isolated instances. They are two, and they are about the only two, apart from one 12-year-old I have in primary school, in my whole cohort of my own and my associates' workload of our students who are in school beyond year 7. I live in Benalla, husband's a local GP. At a recent dinner of doctors, I was speaking to one who my class is a very compassionate, aware and sensible person. And he said to me, because I have a background of teaching, but these kids are probably not much different to the kids you work with at school. No, Paul, my kids don't go to school. And he found that just unbelievable. What I'm trying to say is that until we create an awareness of just the extent of the exclusion from our society that we put these kids in once they come under any sort of care of the Department of Human Services, we have to make people aware of the extent of the exclusion and the horrific results of what our society does to kids before we've got much hope of improving life for these kids.
And I agree 100%. It's a tremendous issue here in Victoria, and I'm sure it's national, that the young people that we are talking about are square pegs in round holes when it comes to an orthodox education system. Here in Victoria, we've been very disappointed over the last few months to see that the VCAL program has been underfunded or defunded, and that's a program that assisted a lot of young people to be involved in a range of flexible learning options that were keeping them in active learning, and but I couldn't agree more. We have to get these kids going to school. We have to get them feeling positive and looking forward rather than treating them drowning.
Okay. Dennis Fitzgerald, Catholic Social Services, Victoria. There are so many dimensions, it's very, very difficult to follow on the last comment. But just to go back to the place-based analysis, and I guess Professor Vinson's told us many times that we need general approaches as well as place-based initiatives to build cohesion and the rest of it. Just wondering from some of the panel members, how are government initiatives going in that area? I mean, a lot of work on neighbourhood renewal, on programs, Commonwealth, municipal, state levels. I remember the secretaries of Victorian government departments visited Shepparton in a group, probably when Patricia was there. Just what sort of traction is there, and what's needed to drive further into delivering on Tony's analysis?
As people will appreciate, I no longer work in a government department, but I have a number of appointments, so I may be a bit out of date, but certainly neighbourhood renewal, there are probably people from the Department of Human Services here who might know, has been committed to over a long period of time. I'm not sure of the current situation, and it has evidence that it actually works. It builds community strength. It does a range of things that help people who were previously outside an education system, a training system or a work system to be included in all of that. So it does work, and Victoria has had some good initiatives and good evaluations in relation to that. The last federal budget actually provided place-based funding for 10 very disadvantaged locations across Australia. Again, pushing on from Tony Vinson's work through the Social Inclusion Board, I had the opportunity to speak to the federal cabinet about the findings of our research and the absolute need to treat our society unequally in government policy sense. There's a bit of a tradition in public service to be even-handed, but the problems exist in particular locations. So there is money available at the moment. There's a new place-based committee headed by Tony Nicholson that's trying to guide the federal government's implementation of place-based initiatives. So the work continues. I suppose my disappointment is that we know these things work. We know intervening in a different fashion works, but it's always seen as a thing on the edge. It's a pilot. It doesn't actually ever get to change practice substantially. And I think that's where we need to think again, to sort of talk about how you change practice. I mentioned the finding about, and I'm diverting slightly, but about how you treat people. And certainly having the Minister for Human Services as the Minister for Social Inclusion has meant she's now prepared in Centrelink offices to try and turn around the way in which people who go to Centrelink are treated by, they've changed their forms. Instead of starting off by talking about all the deficiencies that people have, they've been asked to think about asking the people what they're good at, which is a strengths-based approach. So we need cultural changes like that, So place-based initiatives, I think there are successful ones right across Australia. I don't know the rest of Australia as well as Victoria. They do work, but it's really hard to sustain that culture of unequal treatment, of non-portfolio based interventions. So there's always a pressure for a minister to say, I want to pick the locations for education, someone else wants to pick them for jobs, someone else wants to pick them. So I think it's very hard work and it requires a massive cultural change.
Thanks, Frank. I just wanted to draw together a couple of the themes.
Jonathan, could you just introduce
yourself? Sorry. Jonathan Hunyar. I'm from the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, which is the Aboriginal Legal Service in Darwin. Just that when Tony talked about social efficacy and social capital, and one of the things that concerns me is that the tough on crime, locking people up approach, it doesn't just go against that, but it actively, doesn't just detract resources and attention from that, but it actually actively goes against it because of the damage that prisons do. So prisons create prisoners, and Terry spoke of the damage that prison does to particularly young people, or detention does to young people. And it's one of the things that I think, when we heard Frank talk last night about the responsibility of our society, he was talking, I think, in a more general sense, but I think when we're looking at the justice system, the first thing we should make sure is that we're not doing more harm, and that's what concerns me when we hear politicians talking about building new, expanding our jails, building new prisons, is that actually what we're doing is undermining these other things that we know work. So not only are we doing something that doesn't work, but we're actually doing something that does harm.
I just want to respond to that because I think it's a really valid point. I think it's a really important point. If we don't respect the laws that govern us, then what do we get out of it from anybody's point of view? And the point I was trying to make, probably fairly inadequately last night, about mandatory sentencing is exactly that. If you're asking the people who are in fact running a justice system to engage in mandatory sentencing, and they can demonstrate to themselves in everything they do that it simply isn't right, and by that I mean taking kids from, say, the Warracoon or the Lands down to Perth, where they then stay, they get on a train to come home, they never make it. The police who live in those places know that that's the problem. And they take a view about mandatory sentencing, as does everybody else. It turns everybody into people who try to find ways around the system. The same thing applies in relation to fines. In Western Australia, you can have people come into your courts that have fines of upwards of $30,000 and $50,000. They haven't got two brass razors to rub together, and they know that ultimately they'll be picked up in respect of the fines, and you'll have them say to themselves, well, the fines don't mean anything to me, I'll just cut it out. It just engenders no respect for the system, and I'm not suggesting that respect is ultimately what we should be insisting Aboriginal people bring to the system, but it engenders no respect from any of us.
Tony. Oh.
Thank you. A couple of references have been made to, and particularly from our last penultimate last speaker, about the antipathy, I guess, between the correctional system and strengthening communities, and also reference was made earlier to the better quality, I think, services available if you go before a court as a juvenile. Look, this is to anticipate the third topic today, where I get another chance to say something, so I'll be brief. Anything that I've seen that's I found terrific in the way of dealing with some social issues, particularly law breaking, and I'm particularly fond of the Dutch system of some few years ago and the Swedish system. The last thing they want is to try and cure problems by involving the justice system. From the very word go, as you say, you're stained. Others have called it labelling. It is with the greatest reluctance that countries or national systems that everyone praises, with the greatest reluctance that they'll go anywhere near the jail to try and find a solution to a problem. So in a general way, we just have to do some of the things that were being mentioned earlier and not rely on the justice system at all. But, except for those things where it's absolutely inevitable, a last resort is the expression frequently used. On the matter of exclusion, setting aside all the statistics and everything else, I must say that after being the chief screw for New South Wales for 3 years and various other comparable experiences, I came to the very springs of disadvantage when I started talking with little kids of 3 and 4 in preschools in New South Wales. It just seemed to me that if we were only concerned about efficiency, we could give them a pass to Long Bay or one of the other prisons at that stage. They were starting so far behind Tours. It was going to take every bit of initiative and every bit of effort to give them anything approximating a fair crack of the whip in their lives. So the only thing is, it wasn't, the exclusion may have been twofold. In some instances, yes, the schools, by suspending people, by saying this child was disruptive or whatever, that's one form of exclusion, which we've got to do better in handling. But the exclusion in many of the instances which would bring tears to the eyes, frankly, of people in this room, were the result of lack of knowledge, lack of interest, suspension of interest due to other dependencies and what have you, which would make the overcoming of exclusion very strongly a matter of outreach to those families quite outside of the school. The school can be a terrific school, but the first thing you've got to do is get the kids in there. So I just wanted to make those comments.
And at the risk, if I can, I'd like to bring us back to that very point where children often come into the justice system, and at the risk of not leaving this building alive, I would like to see a children's court system that had no lawyers. I say it very seriously because I think that those people who make judgments about the circumstances, the unsafe circumstances that children find themselves in, are people who have expertise in child and family development, not lawyers. And I, quite frankly, get sick of going to the children's court and seeing people giving each other high fives after a court case and a child wondering what the hell happened, or talking to a child protection worker who's the worst day of the month for that person is going to court where they're getting kicked around the court by lawyers, magistrates and their own bosses. So for heaven's sake, we've got to do this better. We've got to do this better for the sake of children.
Thank you. I'm Jenny Makakos. I'm the Victorian Shadow Minister for Youth Justice. Thank you to all the panel. The comments that have been made have been really insightful. I wanted to touch upon Patricia Faulkner's point about that young people who have a person in their lives who has taken an interest in them can help to turn their life around. And just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we have had since 2005 a state government-funded program called the Youth Mentoring Initiative, which funding is ending at the end of this year. So, as Booney Geary mentioned, we've had the cuts to VCAL, we've had this youth mentoring program that's been in place for a number of years that's now also ending. These are all coming at a time when the state government is proposing introducing mandatory sentencing for juvenile offenders as well as for adult offenders. I don't apologise for being partisan in my comments because I think that policy is absolutely reprehensible. The Victorian opposition will be opposing the introduction of mandatory sentencing, and I'm happy to discuss this further when we get to sentencing later in the day. But I think we have in place a number of positive diversion programs, and I see youth mentoring and programs like VCAL as really important in terms of keeping kids in education, helping them get into employment, and a lot of these are now being dismantled, and I think it's important that people are aware of that. Thank you.
Oh, we might, just for efficiency, we might go there first and then go.
Hi, my name is Tess Bartlett, and I was involved in some research in New Zealand that was done on children of prisoners, and it was called Invisible Children. And I guess I just want to bring up the intergenerational aspect that has been mentioned. And in the study, it was shown that a lot of the children had, like the impact on of their parents being in prison was huge, and they had, you know, the fact that they were then part of broken families and moved from a lot of different family members, and they also had emotional, social and mental effects from the imprisonment and exclusion, and these children were then 7 times as likely to end up in prison as other children. And a lot of the caregivers expressed the concern that the children were paying for a crime that they didn't commit. And and they kind of showed a lack of, they expressed the concern that there was just a lack of support and agencies for the families and children of prisoners. And yeah, so I just wanted to bring that topic up.
That particular group of children has been brought to the attention of the Social Inclusion Board as a group of children that perhaps are not necessarily targeted by government programs. In Victoria, we did introduce for children in the child protection system. We used to have a system where, whilst there was an order on the family, the child got some attention, not enough, but some attention, and then after they left, the order was over, that traumatisation wasn't dealt with. So we started a program called Take Two that did in fact look at giving some therapeutic interventions for children who'd been part of the child protection system. But I do think, and I agree with you, that the children of prisoners don't fall naturally, unless they're child protection cases, which is, you don't want them to be, they don't fall naturally into any service system, and I think it's a very good idea.
Is this working? Yes. My name is Margaret. I wanted to really follow up what the Shadow Minister raised as mentoring. And I want to connect that to 2 things. And one is, we talk about community as though it's a, you know, what is it? For those who've been involved in juvenile justice, in mental health facilities, in places where people with intellectual disability were incarcerated, for those who've been in prison, that's probably the strongest community they've ever been in. And when they leave those places, particularly prisons, and we're talking about prevention and diversion, where do they gravitate? Towards the people they already knew, with whom they had associated, who taught them how to lie more effectively, hopefully how not to get caught again, how to do bigger and better crimes very often. They used to call Pentridge the Bluestone College. So I make that point, but I also make, it's about relationships and connecting with people. And the word mentoring has been around for quite a while. Whatever the word is, it's like having a friend who is in a different planet, as it were, someone whom they can admire, someone whom they respect, who's there for them. I see again and again that the people who walk with the various people, I've worked in those areas within the prison system, and they are very vulnerable because they're lonely and they want a friend. They feel good when they walk around with whoever it is, male or female. Okay, sorry.
And
I think
just adding to that, one of the children who lives in residential care down in Geelong said to me one day that she felt that she wasn't special in the eyes of anyone. Wow. Yes.
Hi, I'm Susan Baydowie from Monash University. I just noticed that a lot of the strategies and solutions that were being commented on focused around accessing services, whether it be VCAL and education and mental health. And we're doing a current study, with Bernie Leary's office, looking at youth justice and child protection and the 2 systems and how they're working together. And what we've seen a lot of is the issue of homelessness and transience and how that impacts on workers even being able to access their own clients. A lot of the time the workers in the residential in the residential units don't even see their clients. They're lucky if those people sleep there 2 nights a week, and they'll aim to increase that to 3 or 4. How can we start looking at accessing services and increasing services when these clients and young people are so transient that they can't even have a base to call community?
Someone's got to call this for what it is. For the last 25 years, we've seen a failure of public policy by governments at Commonwealth and state level with respect to housing. I don't see anything on the agenda now that makes it look like we're going to get that much better in the foreseeable future. Certainly in the mental health area, as you're pointing out, there are 3 predictors of how well people recover from serious mental illness. There's huge amounts of other stuff that helps, but if people are housed, if they have gainful activity, and if they are socially networked, those 3 things give people the best chance of actually getting well. And I reckon you can generalise that across a whole range of areas where people experience problems in their life. The number 1 out of those 3 is housing, and we don't have, still in this country, a really sensible public policy debate or a public policy solution about where we're going with housing.
Hi, my name's Emily. I'm currently working at the Metropolitan Remand Centre, effectively as a welfare worker. I was actually, throughout the conversation, I wanted to make quite a contentious theoretical point about what crime is, but actually just the last 2 speakers brought something to light for me. So obviously I work in the prison, and a prisoner said to me the other day he was going to get released the day after, and having a bit of a chat, making sure he was ready for the outcome. He said, "Miss, I don't want to go." He said, "I feel safe when I'm in prison." And one of those points was homelessness, because we can only find them short-term crisis housing. So obviously homelessness is a big issue. And those 3 points you've just made there, social inclusion, well, that's going up to your point. For some of these people, prison is their community. Especially if they're coming in and out, they've actually made friends there. And that is their community, that's where they feel safe. And you said that they need programs and services. They get that in prison, and they've got their housing. So they feel safe, they know where their food is coming from, they don't have to think about bills, utilities. And isn't that a shame that for some people, they would rather be in custody? In and out, in and out.
I'd like to comment on that, and I'm very pleased you said at the end of it, some people, not every people. Not every prisoner wants to stay in custody. And I think that point needs to be made really, really powerfully, because there's a general perception amongst some people that Aboriginal people really quite like remaining in custody, and it simply isn't the case. So it is important to note, it's some people, it's not every prisoner.
Just to add to that, prisons are very dangerous places. You have more risk of being assaulted. How would you know? You've got very high HIV rates, Hep C rates. They're just very dangerous places to be in. They're very tense.
Stephen Male, Magistrate. I sit both in the Children and Magistrates Court in regional Victoria. The point earlier about the extent of mental illness amongst those young people who are in custody, there's been a shift in the offences for which young people are now in custody in Victoria in the past 10 to 15 years. About 10 to 15 years ago, and I think this can be confirmed probably later today, I think Paul Grant, Judge Paul Grant, the President of the Children's Court, will be here, and he may be able to give the precise detail, but it's in essence it's this, that until about 1992, 93, maybe mid-90s, about 3/4 of the people who were serving periods of detention in a youth justice centre were there for property offences. I think it's now about 85%, maybe even higher than that, 90%, who are in custody are there for offences against the person. The judicial response to the conduct has been a marked shift. The way in which the judiciary evaluates culpability for an offence against the person has changed. Indeed, it's suffice to say it's the same for property. It's been quite a reversal. So when you analyse why it is, or rather the offences for which a young person is in custody, one can then go to the question I think raised by Greg Jones. What's the predisposition of that person before entry to custody? And then you analyse the psychiatric and psychological reports, and I know a couple of colleagues here from the Children's Court who are specialist Children's Court magistrates could probably be clearer about this than myself. There is then a very high correlation between mental illness, personality disorder, psychiatric, psychological disposition of varying degrees, with very complex personal histories, dysfunctional family lives. So I think it's interesting to look at the cohort that are detained, serving a conviction and detention order. The figures have been, as I understand it from recently speaking with President Grant, have been stable in terms of the actual number that have been in custody. There's been relative stability or consistency in the Victorian reception rate for detention in custody. The nature of the offence for which you're in custody has in fact changed. So in terms of analysis of those in custody, I think it's helpful to have a look at that, because I think it's fair to say that judicial officers, regardless of the jurisdiction in which they're sitting, apply the principles both in the Sentencing Act for adult offenders, which is imprisonment is a sanction of last resort, and apply that generally. And for the Children's Court, Children, Youth and Families Act, quite different sentencing consideration. The regimen of sentencing principles has been very different, with different primacy to, for example, rehabilitation of the child, the young person. Detention is a sanction of last resort. And if you analyse the particular cases for which people are in custody for, not just maybe the particular facts of a case, which in some circumstances, given the objective gravity of the conduct, no other disposition other than immediate detention is appropriate. In other circumstances, preceding their reception into custody, there's been a very significant number of pre-existing proceedings, priors effectively, when non-custodial or non-detention dispositions have been sought and have failed. So that's not to be an apologist for the system, but I think it's clear that the individual cases require some analysis in that way. It's very easy to make generalities about the judicial response to this sort of conduct, but in fact, the impression one gets is that great care and attention is taken by judicial officers to considering options other than detention for young people. But it is, at times, the objective gravity of the conduct is such that, bearing in mind the Court of Appeal decisions and common law sentencing principles and the application of the provisions of the Act, that a period of detention is sadly the option that's adopted. But I suspect in many cases with great reluctance.
We have time for one more. Who'd like to? Yes.
My name's John Doherty. I work in the policy office of the education system, and I've had a son who has had or did have significant engagement with the criminal justice system. I'd just like to make a comment and refer to last night's address, where we're talking about the values that underpin a lot of these sorts of issues. And my experience is that I agree that prison is a particularly hostile and tense environment, but equally the sorts of environments that my son engaged with outside the prison was equally hostile and tense. And largely because of his drug addiction, lots of the community, because I don't think there is a single community, there is a range of different communities which are fragmenting in this, what we call wider Australia. So my perspective of this is that we can describe the problem continually, and we all agree. But the real issue, it seems to me, is to address the issues of the values that underpin this process. So we talk about an issue in relation to exclusion in education, but how many people here send their children to private schools? And I think that's an issue in terms of whether you support private schooling or not. the issue is that it's one of the issues that underpins the notion of exclusion, fragmentation of society, isolation and exclusion, going back to that concept. So my view is that probably the question should be, what are the preconditions for a justice system that we would like to see that addresses social equity?
Now, to conclude, would any member of the panel like to make a very quick final observation?
Can I make a comment to Steve's comment about the Victorian judiciary and, in fact, the Children's Court, and say that, of course, this is a national seminar, and I think that the situation across the country is not as replicated as it might be in Victoria.
Ladies and gentlemen, could I invite you to express your appreciation to Tony, Kate, Bernie, Patricia, Pop. I'd like to thank you too, and let's acknowledge the depth of experience, passion and competence there is here in the room. We're now going to allow a full 30 minutes for morning tea, and we'd encourage you, you've got name tags, so please introduce yourselves to people you don't know, and be aware we're going to come back for 2 sessions back to back before lunch, so there's a fair bit of work to do before lunch, so please do have a very hearty morning tea and be back punctually at 11 a.m. Thank you.